Welcome to the latest episode of the Healthcare Innovation Podcast by Healthark Insights. Today, our guest is Sethi. For those of you who don't know her, she has a really inspirational story to share with us, how she converted a personal challenge into an opportunity to help so many different individuals. So, Jazz, welcome to this episode. Thank you so much for taking the time. Would love for you to start with maybe an introduction and a brief background, your story for our listeners today.
Thank you, Purav, and thank you for inviting me to this. It's a pleasure to be here today. So basically my story sort of relays back to when I was 13 years old, and it's about 13 years ago. Actually, it's quite funny. 13 years ago, I was 13 years old, and I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I remember sort of like losing a lot of weight and just being very thirsty and just being very tired. And my parents, as any Indian parents would, were like, let's go to the family doctor. Let's just, find out what's happening. And the family doctor just saying that, get a blood test, get a urine test. And the results came to my father, and I was rushed to the emergency room. And it was said that my sugar was 1050. And I was declared as a type 1 diabetic. And it's safe to say that overnight my life changed. It changed very suddenly to a new normal that I had to adapt to. And for the longest time, as a 13-year-old, I kept sort of going onto YouTube. I kept sort of going onto Google and finding out what does type 1 diabetes mean. And I was always bombarded with text heavy, very boring kind of, information for a 13-year-old. That was not fun at all. So flash forward to around 10 years later, when I decided that I want to do something about this. I want others not to go through what I went through as a child. And that's when I started the Diabesties Foundation, which is basically a movement dedicated to type 1 diabetes. And it's to make those with type 1 diabetes feel heard, supported, understood, and celebrated through advocacy, through access to education, and through support. So that's my story. It's about basically turning the why me into what if, because I had that why me moment. I think anyone who goes through a chronic condition has that why me moment. Like, why did this have to happen to me? But when you convert that into an opportunity to try to do something for others who are going through what you are going through, is when Diabesties was formed.
So, yes, I want to hear a little more about Diabesties, but when you and I interacted for the first time, right, you told me about diabetes, type 1 diabetes, and I'm a physician, but still there was so much I didn't know about it. So maybe if you can tell a little bit about the current state of management of type 1 diabetes, and then how you started Diabesties and what are the activities you do today.
Sure, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think in India specifically, diabetes is known as sugar ki bimari. So I feel like a lot of people just generalize diabetes into one word, and it's not true, because there's so many different types of diabetes which have different pathologies, they have different physiologies, and they have different treatment options. So type 1 diabetes, the thing that I'm living with, basically is an autoimmune condition where your body mistakenly destroys the beta cells of your pancreas, and the beta cells are responsible for producing insulin. Insulin is a hormone that basically regulates the glucose you get from the food you eat into energy. So it's very important hormone. And people with type 1 diabetes, there's no cause, there's no cure. It's a chronic condition, which means you're going to live with it for the rest of your life.
Are you sure you're not a physician, Jazz?
I like to think I'm a now after so many years. Thank you for that, Purav. It boosted my ego a lot. But basically, we are insulin dependent for life, which means that we need to take insulin externally every single day. And it could be through an insulin injection multiple times a day. It's called MDI, multiple daily injections. Or it could be through an insulin pump, which is what I'm using at the moment. We need to check our sugars at least 8 times a day to know what range we are at. We need to deal with hypos and hypers, which are like crashing sugars and peaking sugars. We need to balance our diets. We need to exercise regularly to ensure that we live a balanced life.
Got it. So that's helpful to understand. Not everyone understands type 1 diabetes. Type 2 is so common in India and well understood, so people could confuse both
That's right.
very easily. So now that you mentioned that there is lack of awareness, and I think at both levels, right? Not only at patient level, but also in terms of treatment. Right? You could get insulin, that's available, but everything around it is not available. So what are the kind of activities that you do at Diabesties to support these patients, and how does it help them?
Right. So I think what you said was very true. Like access to insulin is it's still a big deal in India, but it's getting better. The main idea is that as a country, we lack in type 1 diabetes education at a healthcare professional level as well as at a patient level. So I'll give you my example, and I always say this. I was diagnosed at a very fancy private hospital in Ahmedabad, and I am very aware of the place of privilege I speak from when I say that I was given the best care. But even then, I was given a prescription of saying that take this much insulin per meals and go. So I always sort of maintain that there's a difference between staying alive with type 1 diabetes and living with type 1 diabetes. Staying alive is doable. You take the insulin, you don't die, so to say. But living with type 1 diabetes is a whole different ball game. It's about understanding your patterns. It's about understanding how 20 billion things can affect your sugars. How do you go to school with type 1? How do you give exams with type 1? How do you get married with type 1 diabetes? Like these are all the things that are never taught to us as when we're diagnosed. And like I said, as a kid, I used to go onto YouTube and try to look for videos about type 1 diabetes. And all I found was like doctors sitting and giving long lectures. So Diabesties actually began just wanting to become a YouTube channel. I just said, let's make type 1 diabetes fun. Let's make it relatable. Let's make it glamorous. That's how we started. And then when we sort of interacted with people, we understood the hotspots in India. We understood the need. We became a registered foundation. And now it's 5 years in. We work with all the national and international bodies of diabetes in India. We focus a lot on type 1 diabetes education through lived experience, because understanding the basics, understanding the nuances of living with this condition is what actually makes you get a better quality of life. We also focus a lot on rural outreach, where it's about going into the villages, going into the under-resourced sectors wherein they don't even have access to insulin. It's about peer support. It's about counseling. It's about really making this entire life with type 1 diabetes for all its stakeholders, not only the person who's living with it, but also the caregivers, also the HCPs, talking about language, talking about education, and just making it a more doable and a condition where you can thrive and not just survive.
Got it. Got it. And maybe if you can also tell us a little bit about the scale of your foundation, like how big it is, how many patients do you generally kind of interact with?
So we currently have 20 chapters in India. So we call them chapters, and we have in 20 different cities, we have our presence where we do events, where we do education counseling. Our flagship project is something called Back to Basics. It's a one-on-one counseling and education session. So we've done over 750 calls in 1 year, and ranging from people from all over India to also international. We've just begun our Saudi Arabian wing of Diabesties in Jeddah, and we're expanding to places in Europe as well. And we touch about 10,000 to 20,000 type 1s through our immediate, indirect, and direct networks. My team has 50 people right now who are all working at Diabesties, and they're all people living with type 1 diabetes.
Wow, that's fantastic. So, Jazz, this is type 1 diabetes that we discussed, but overall, from my experience in healthcare in India, there is limited understanding of patient support, not just for type 1, but also type 2, at least at a relative scale. And same for many other conditions. And from my understanding, it's also fragmented. There are very few national level efforts going on. So, and I do this once in a while, but you do this for a living. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about the state of patient support programs and activities in India? And what are some of the challenges? What are some of the efforts that can help overcome that?
So true, right? So I think for the longest time, patient support, a support group, was considered a weakness, right? Because we are conditioned to believe in India that if you require support for something, you are weak or you are inferior. So I think it took a long time for us to break that stigma and to break that mind frame to say that no, support does not only go for people who are weaker, support goes to people who are just wanting to find others like them. And that was the biggest shift. So for the longest time, right, like when I was growing up, we didn't have this concept of a support group because it was also always considered a weakness. And that's very different from the concept in the West, right? In London, in the UK, in the US, there was always patient support groups being very fundamental and crucial to a development of the person living with the condition. I think we broke that barrier in 2019 in India, where we said that no, patient support groups are not meant for just people who require support, but they're meant for empowerment, they're meant for engagement. And in these efforts, we are trying to do a lot of meaningful engagement with the community. The other problem about India, I would say specifically, is that there is so much stigma about diabetes, about type 1 diabetes. I still get asked, did you get it because you ate too much sugar? It's like, no, I got it because my body decided to attack itself. But just things from like, basically talking about, will you be able to get married? Will you have kids? Will you, something wrong has happened with you? Just mata chad gayi hai. Like these are things that I can't even make up, and these are the realities of India. So I think as India, because we're such a multicultural country, stigma is a huge barrier that we face. Secondly, the other thing is at a GP level in the rural villages, as general practitioners, the amount of death before diagnosis we have in India probably is the highest that I have come across, just because GPs are not aware that there are different types of diabetes, which is why one of the biggest efforts that we are trying to do as a community, as an advocacy standpoint, is for people to always mention the type of diabetes when they're talking about diabetes. Because we've seen posters, saying the diabetes reversal program. But you have to understand that diabetes reversal does not pertain to type 1 diabetes. It could be a type 2 workshop. But when you have a family that has just been diagnosed, they are vulnerable, they are hopeful, they are desperate. A mother comes to me desperate to find an alternative to insulin. They will get swayed by this kind of a poster which talks about diabetes reversal and could potentially put their child at risk. So I think we at a very systemic level need to change a few things. One is always mentioning type. One is eradicating stigma. And one is educating our GPs at a rural level to understand that there are different types of diabetes, and whether they can or cannot treat it, they need to refer them to a specialist.
Got it. Now, the next question, and I'm personally a skeptic, I would say, but people talk about digital being the next big thing, the game changer in terms of everything in healthcare. What's your experience? Where does it have a role and where does it not have a role?
For me, honestly, like for our foundation, the pandemic has been a blessing. And I say this with completely knowing what it's done to everyone. So no disrespect. But we never thought before the pandemic that we could reach places where we were not physically present. And that changed when we went digital and when we went virtual. So I think we are able to impact so many more people than we would have ever if we just thought that we had to have someone physically present. So for us, digital has been the way to go. Like I said, our B2B project, which is the back to basics, the one-on-one counseling, it happens on Zoom. You schedule through WhatsApp, and it's impacted so many people. And it's not only impacted people at a quality of life perspective, but we have gotten data that, and we are publishing very soon, that says that after our B2B sessions, there has been clinical improvements as well. HbA1cs have come down, frequency of hypos have come down, frequency of hypers have come down. We have done peer support parties online on Zoom. Now, while I'm aware that not everyone has access to a smartphone, while I'm aware that not everyone has access to the internet, a majority of people now do, even in the rural sector. So we're trying to really leverage that capacity and try to reach as many people as we can to give as much impact as we can. So it's for me, like, and for us at Diabesties, it's been a blessing, honestly.
I also love the fact that you said that a lot of this you do is on WhatsApp and Zoom, and but it also tells for a lot of people who are trying to innovate in this space that you don't always need to spend millions of dollars on building an app.
Oh
And
my
have
God,
those
you have spoken my mind. Okay. Let me give you like a backup over here, right? We sort of toyed with the idea. So when Back to Basics, our project got so successful and we understood the impact, we said, let's innovate, let's make an app. But then I just kept going back to the point of, I want to make this as easy as it can be. I want my maid to be able to schedule a WhatsApp, to schedule a B2B session, right? So I want to go to make this the most effortless and most easy process possible. What is the easiest thing in India? It's WhatsApp. Everyone uses it. So let's not go with the fluff of being very important and trying to make it very like fancy. No, basics, like go back to the fundamentals. And that's what our project is called. It's called Back to Basics. So I really sort of feel like let's use what we have to our advantage to make it as accessible as it can be.
Absolutely. I mean, the differentiator at the end of the day is the value you add in the sessions and not a proprietary app or something. So this kind of is a segue into my last question. And this one is less about type 1 diabetes, but you built a foundation, you built an organization which is doing something very different, kind of paving its own way within the healthcare system. So if you can talk a little bit about challenges in organization building that you faced, trying to do something new, what are some of the lessons that other healthcare innovators, right, type 1 diabetes or anything else, that can learn from your journey?
So I have always maintained collaboration over confrontation. And especially when you're in the healthcare space, and I always say this, and I'm never ashamed of saying this, but there is a lot of politics in philanthropy as well, right? So I think it's about just making sure that you as a patient organization, I can say we are never averse to healthcare professionals, right? We always focus on a collaborative journey. We focus on better together. I'm giving a talk in a couple of days, and my entire topic is about how patients and doctors can come together to actually make a better change. So I think for anyone who's starting out in the healthcare space, it's about finding the right people. It's about aligning with the right people. It's about focusing on collaboration and not confrontation. Because in India, we have to realize that, at least as a patient organization, there's nothing you can do without the healthcare professional support. And it's about sort of making sure that we are in this together, we are working together, and there are skills that the HCPs possess that I don't possess. And I'm very unashamed to say that. But there are also skills and the basic fact that I have lived experience that the healthcare professional does not possess. So when those two come together, it's a puzzle like fitting together, because we complement each other's skills, we complement each other's gaps, and we can actually make a change that could not have been done without the other person. So I would just say that it's about just finding the right people who believe in you. I was very lucky and blessed to find people who believed in the Diabesties mission very earlier on. And without their support, like Dr. Banshi Sabu, Dr. Jyoti Dev, Dr. Manoj Chavla, Purvi Chavla, Archana Sarda, like all these guys, Dr. V. Mohan, oh my God, without their support, I wouldn't be where I am right now. So it's about finding the people who believe in your mission and then proving your worth, that that mission can actually become a reality.
Well said, well said. Well, just thanks so much for kind of sharing the story, the work that you do, as well as some of the lessons from that journey. I'm sure it would be kind of both inspirational as well as useful for people who are trying to do something in this space. So thanks so much for your time.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.